Good evening. It's great to see so many of you here for the William F. Buckley Jr. Program's first event of the fall semester. My name is Josh Altman, and I'm the student president of the Buckley Program. Before I introduce our guest for this evening, I'd like to express some gratitude to the Young America's Foundation, the Irving Brown Lecture Series, and Miss Carol Brown. The Buckley Program is dedicated to the promotion of intellectual diversity on Yale's campus. We at the Buckley Program have a strong belief that Yale would fail its principal mission of educating the leaders of tomorrow if it neglects to prepare students for the complexities that exist outside of the ivory tower. To put it more bluntly, if Yale students leave this institution thinking that leftism is gospel, that the right offers no solutions, and that interruption constitutes free speech, Yale has done a disservice to its students. To prevent the entrenchment of this phenomenon, which was first diagnosed by Bill Buckley over 50 years ago and got a man at Yale, the Buckley Program hosts lectures, debates, and conferences with guests who hold views that diverge from campus orthodoxy and challenge Yale students on their principles. As of last May, the Buckley Program boasted over 174 student fellows, and the topics of our events ran the gamut, from discussing the philosophical underpinnings of American conservatism to discussing the Obama administration's liberalization of relations with Cuba, and of course, to the perennial question, what is going on in American college campuses? For those of you who observed the events of last fall from afar, let me make this much clear. The Buckley Program stands firm in its commitment to protecting free speech on campus, and we will remind every single Yale student that prudent and reasonable people will disagree on how to resolve the complex issues at hand. To freshmen and upperclassmen who are interested in learning more about the Buckley Program, I recommend that you visit buckleyprogram.com to learn more about how to become a Buckley Program Fellow. And tonight we are kicking off a semester of stellar events with Mr. Ben Shapiro, and we will continue next Monday with a firing line debate on climate change policy with Mr. Jeremy Carl of the Hoover Institution and Professor William Nordhaus of Yale. And now to introduce our esteemed guest. A graduate of UCLA and Harvard Law School, Ben Shapiro is the editor-in-chief of the Daily Wire and the host of The Ben Shapiro Show. He founded Truth Revolt and is the author of 6 books, including, most recently, The People vs. Barack Obama, and the New York Times bestseller, Bullies, How the Left's Culture of Fear and Intimidation Silences America. Mr. Shapiro is a fierce critic of the BDS movement against Israel, and his current tour seeks to combat liberal illiberalism on college campuses. The Buckley Program is honored to be hosting him this evening, so without further ado, speaking on white privilege, multiculturalism, and other leftist myths, Mr. Ben Shapiro.
Well, thank you so much for having me. My mother will finally be pleased that I got to Yale. So first of all, thank you to Young America's Foundation. Brief note, if my voice seems to be going out, if I start hacking up a lung, it's just because I watched Hillary Clinton fall down on YouTube, and it's so contagious that alone seems to have affected me. Okay, so today, we're going to talk about all the dumb, stupid, nonsense words your professors and your administrators and students on this campus use to stifle debate and shut down opposition and excuse violence. So we're going to go through particularly, and we're going to debunk 5 of the most common campus terms that you hear all the time from the fascist left: diversity, white privilege, trigger warnings, microaggressions, and safe spaces. So the full hit list. Now, here's the warning. This exercise may make some people on the left a little upset. It may trigger some people. It may be construed as a microaggression. So there's your warning. If you don't like it, you can leave now. Facts tend to do that to people. And, the good news is facts don't care about your feelings, as I'm fond of saying, and neither do I. So, with that said, let's jump right in. So let's start with the first nonsense term the left likes to use, and that is diversity. So a few months back, I spoke at Cal State University, Los Angeles. A few days before I was scheduled to speak, the president of the university decided that it was imperative that my lecture be canceled. and he issued a letter explaining why he had canceled this lecture. He wrote, quote, "After careful consideration, I've decided that it will be best for our campus community if we reschedule Ben Shapiro's appearance for a later date so we can arrange for him to appear as part of a group of speakers with differing viewpoints on diversity. Such an event will better represent our university's dedication to the free exchange of ideas and the value of considering multiple viewpoints." So it's so important to consider multiple viewpoints and have a free exchange of ideas that the one idea they don't like has to be shut down in the name of diversity. And that's what diversity means. Diversity generally means on college campuses, shut up lest you make some people uncomfortable, because diversity can't thrive where people disagree. Everybody has to agree in order for diversity to really bloom. This idea goes back a long ways, back to a professor named Herbert Marcuse. He said back in the 1960s that he was in favor of what he called liberating tolerance as opposed to the repressive tolerance of free speech. He said free speech was just demonstration that there was this patriarchal, heteronormative order that crammed down freedom on people, and so freedom had to be overthrown. Free speech was repressive tolerance. What he wanted was liberating tolerance, and the only way to have liberating tolerance was to shut down everybody who disagreed with him. So true tolerance meant that you couldn't tolerate anybody who disagreed with him, which makes perfect sense if you're highly educated, but makes no sense if you have a basic shred of common sense. Marcuse's ideological grandchildren now run the campuses. So when I got to Cal State LA, a near riot broke out. The reason that I have security, I didn't have to have security a year ago when I did speeches, but because of all the security problems that we've had at my speeches in the past, I now have to have my friends in security. Students barricaded the doors, people pulled fire alarms, all in the name of diversity, all to show that this is what diversity was really about. And wasn't it just wonderful? Which begs the question, if the left doesn't care about diversity of thought, what exactly do they mean by diversity? Now, we all know what the left means by diversity. What the left means by, well, I haven't said anything bigoted yet, so you might want to wait. What the left means is racial diversity. But racial diversity, as we all know from being decent human beings, really shouldn't mean much. A racially diverse criminal gang isn't a better enterprise than an all-black church choir. Values matter significantly more than melanin level. And if you believe the opposite, this makes you a racist. Racial diversity doesn't mean anything. Decency means something. Diversity is not a bad thing, but it isn't a good thing unless the people who are racially diverse are also decent. Diversity isn't a bad thing unless the people who are racially diverse are indecent. This is not a difficult thing. Diversity isn't our strength. Decency is our strength. Robert Putnam is the author of a book called Bowling Alone, big New York Times bestseller. He's on the left, and he used to believe in this mantra, diversity is our strength. And then he started doing experiments regarding communities, and what he saw was that in diverse communities, racial, ethnic diversity, which these days comes along with diversity of fundamental values, thanks to the multicultural left, it didn't lead to better, more cohesive, and more tolerant communities. And again, this is Robert Putnam, who's on the left. He wrote this. He said, the only two things that go up as diversity of your census tract goes up are protest marches and television watching. He concluded that the only way that you could actually create social capital, and social capital, of course, is the thing that allows you to leave your door unlocked at night and allows your neighbor to babysit your kids. The only thing that leads to that is decency, shared values. The only thing that allows people of diverse backgrounds not to be polarized by tribal identity, to live together and to overcome their tribalism, is decent behavior. But unfortunately, the left only cares about racial diversity. That's all they care about. It's a racist philosophy, and they make themselves feel good by saying they stand for racial diversity rather than values. No objective standard of behavior, just the level of the melanin in your skin is what counts, or the country that you came from, or the ethnicity of your parents. Which means that, for example, at this university, the Yale Dramatic Association board holds new auditions for a play after people whine that a white woman was cast in a role normally played by a black man. It doesn't matter that the white woman was auditioning next to 9 people of color who auditioned. She won the part. The black people didn't. That meant that they had to redo the auditions. And the board said, quote, we recognize the pain that this situation has caused, and that this new decision may come too late for some and may hurt others. It sounds like there's a murder plot or something. Still, we hope that reopening auditions will give the Yale community another opportunity to bring new and varied voices to the stage, except, of course, for Sarah Chapin, the white woman who is thrown out of the role. She can go screw herself because she's a white woman who happened to beat out some people of color for this role. So she has to lose, they have to win, not because of merit, not because of standards, but because of the color of her skin. What underlies this notion that diversity of skin color ought to matter more than decency? Well, the left, basic leftist philosophy, believes in equality of outcome and what they like to call fairness. Not fairness of opportunity, meaning lack of government obstacles, fairness of outcome. Thomas Sowell calls this the quest for cosmic justice, the idea that you need a fair outcome. That's what guarantees equality. Real equality is fairness of outcome. Inequality means inequity. By the same token, if there are two people in a room and one person is rich and one person is poor, something bad has happened. Some inequity has taken place. And if it turns out that one group of people with one skin color doesn't do as well economically as another group of people with another skin color, the left believes fairness of outcome hasn't been achieved, which means that the people who are in the group that's underachieving economically, that group is victimized. The people in that group are victimized. They've been sinned against. The left believes that freedom and liberty in America, the philosophy of individualism, this is insufficient to guarantee equality. If it were sufficient, we'd all end up in the same place. At the end of our lives, we'd have the same amount of wealth, we'd have had the same amount of education, but we don't. And so the left believes inequality equals inequity, and they are the same thing. So, what's to blame for all of this inequality and inequity? And this brings us to our second disgusting term of art, white privilege. According to the left, if there's inequality of outcome, there must be some shadowy, evil white privilege out there in the ether that is quashing people of other colors. That white privilege is inherent in everything from capitalism to free speech. You can't escape it. It's like Casper the Friendly Ghost. You can't see it, but it's there. Any system that doesn't result in racial diversity must be the result of this evil, terrible white privilege that all people of color suffer under and all white people benefit from. So we have to tear down the system. We tear down white privilege. That's the solution. And this is a pretty seductive idea. It's a pretty flattering idea. The campus left simply gives people a feeling of virtue by counting them as members of a victimized identity group. If you're an underachieving black woman, it's not possible. It's just not possible that you're underachieving because you're not working hard enough or because you took the wrong classes or made the wrong decisions. You must be failing because the system hates you. If you're an underachieving gay Hispanic man, you must be failing because the system has been keeping you down. Now, by this logic, the true bad guys in the world are the white, heterosexual, cisgender males, of course. The system was built by those evil, white, heterosexual, cisgender males, the founding fathers, in order to keep everybody else down. They designed a governmental economic system to protect their own evil interests at the expense of minorities everywhere. And this white privilege extends to all areas of American life. It is inescapable. You're born into it so long as you are white. You're born with a heavy burden on your back that can never be alleviated if you are non-white. Now, there is good news. If you're starting to get depressed because you're a white, heterosexual, cisgender male in the audience, all 7 of you, if you're starting to get depressed about all this, there's good news. We can alleviate your burden of being a white, heterosexual, cisgender male, but only if you admit your guilt and make penance. So the process is easy. All you have to do is acknowledge that everything that you've done that's caused you to be successful is actually not a result of your decision-making or your parents' decision-making. It's a result of your privilege. It's a result of the fact that America is a deeply racist and evil place. The trial of the white, heterosexual, cisgender male is somewhat like a verbal Spanish Inquisition. If you admit your white privilege, you don't have to be accused of white privilege anymore. If you don't admit your white privilege, that's because you're a beneficiary of white privilege. So you confess, and you repent, and you beg mercy, and you whip yourself, and they actually have scourges for sale in the Yale student body office. Mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. Now, before we go further, I want to add a quick caveat here. It's important to define our terms. It's true that black people and other minorities in the United States have suffered historic discrimination. Of course that's true. You'd have to be a fool, an idiot, or a liar not to acknowledge this. It's inarguably true. It's even true that some people are likely suffering from the effects of historic discrimination under Jim Crow, because it turns out that how your parents grew up has impacts on the amount of wealth in which you grow up. But that does not mean that black people right now are suffering from today institutional discrimination. Historic discrimination is insufficient to explain current levels of inequality or to justify discrimination against white people who had nothing to do with Jim Crow. Individuals all over America have different backgrounds. We were all born with different skill sets. We were all born to different sets of parents. Some of us were born rich. Some of us were born poor. Some of us were born smart. Some of us were born slightly less smart. You're at Yale, right? Some people have histories of discrimination. Some people have histories of privilege. Some people were born in the hillbilly culture that J.D. Vance talks about in Hillbilly Elegy. Other people were born in an inner city culture. People are born with all sorts of different backgrounds. But the solution to historic injustice, the solution to how you were born, isn't to perpetrate injustice against other groups. 3 generations ago, my entire extended family was being slaughtered in Europe, and FDR shut the borders. Okay, that doesn't mean that now I get to come along and suggest that all modern American taxpayers have to pay me. That's not how this works. We can't fix where you start in life. There's just no way to do that. There's no way to fix where you start in life. That is beyond your control. It's beyond my control, and it's beyond government's control. Government doesn't have a time machine. It can't go back 150 years and fix everything that was wrong with slavery. Government doesn't have a time machine. It can't go back to the days of Jim Crow and fix everything that was going wrong in the days of Jim Crow. It's beyond your control, my control, and government's control. But the notion of white privilege suggests that no one can ever overcome this burden. You can't overcome where you started in life because there's this giant bear out there called white privilege that's trying to eat you. And even if you make the right decisions, this is what's so crippling about the white privilege discussion. Even if you make the right decisions in life, even if you do the right things, not the wrong things in life, you still won't succeed because there's this monster on your back called white privilege. And that is a lie. That is an absolute outright lie. In general, in America, the freest country ever conceived by man or implemented by his hands, there's another reason that some people fail and some people succeed, because some people make better decisions than other people, and some values are better than other values. Perhaps equality of opportunity only exists so long as people are willing to take advantage of those opportunities. It turns out that's the truth. White privilege isn't reality. It's a cowardly way, a chicken way, to blame someone else for your failures to live up to decent, responsible standards. Whites are not born with a genetic predisposition to doing the right, responsible thing. They're not born into an arbitrary moral system that only benefits whites. There are 3 simple life rules, actually. If you want to avoid permanent poverty in the United States, according to the Brookings Institute, which is the left-leaning institute, you only have to do 3 things to avoid permanent poverty in the United States. Very simple. Graduate high school, get a job, don't have babies before you're married. That's it. You just do those 3 things, you will not be permanently poor in the United States of America. So here's the truth, There is certain privilege, but it's what I like to call decision privilege. Certain decisions are going to privilege you and your children. You're going to have a better life if you pay attention to these things, and they're things that are in your control or in your control on behalf of your children. For example, it turns out the greatest privilege in American life is not white privilege. You want to talk about being born into privilege. The greatest privilege in American life is being born into a 2-parent family. And that's true for every race. This has nothing to do with race. For example, the poverty rate among 2-parent black families in the United States is 7%. 7. The poverty rate among single white mothers is 22%. What happened to white privilege? Why aren't those single white mothers doing better than the 2-parent black families? I mean, did they stop being white when they got knocked up or what? The fact is that if you have babies before you're married, you are more likely to be poor, and it is the single greatest predictor of intergenerational poverty. This is called decision privilege. Here's another decision privilege. I like to call it the not committing crimes privilege. The higher criminality rate in the black community is not the result of some evil white system of skin privilege. It's the result of individuals being criminals. If you don't want to go to jail for murder, I have a quick and handy rule. Don't kill anyone. Here's the fact about that supposedly evil justice system, that evil racist justice system. It actually statistically under-prosecutes murder in minority communities because minority communities are under-policed. When the police do come into contact with black people to take the disgusting Black Lives Matters lie, police are less likely statistically to kill black people than white people in the same circumstances, according to Professor Peter Moskos of the John Jay College of Criminal Justice at CUNY. As early as 1994, the DOJ surveyed felony cases in the country's 75 largest urban areas and found lower felony prosecution rates for blacks than for whites. A deadly force lab study from Washington State University in the last couple of years found that participants were biased in favor of black suspects, not against them, in favor of them in simulated threat scenarios. In 2015, the DOJ analyzed the Philadelphia Police Department. They found that white officers were less likely than black or Hispanic officers to shoot unarmed black suspects. A widely publicized survey that just came out, a study that just came out from Harvard professor Roland Fryer in July 2016, surveyed over 1,000 police shootings and found that black suspects are shot significantly less often than white suspects in comparable situations. Fryer, for what it's worth, is black. In 2015, the cops shot 987 people. A huge majority of those people were armed or threatening deadly force. Blacks represented 26% of the people who were shot, even though blacks represent in the United States nearly 50% of all murder suspects. Police officers are 18.5 times more likely to be shot by a black male than an unarmed black male is likely to be killed by police. Okay, how about the white privilege of stop and frisk? You hear this one all the time, right? There's white privilege that tends to stop and frisk, driving while black. In New York City, minorities keep running into cops because minorities keep committing an outsized share of crimes. The stop and frisk fiasco in New York City, where Bill de Blasio, the moron mayor, thinks stop and frisk is evidence of racism. From January to June 2008, 98% of all gun assailants in New York City were Hispanic or black. Stop and frisk in that city statistically under-targeted minorities. Only 85% of the people stopped and frisked were Hispanic or black. If there's white privilege, if there is, it's in over-policing white communities. Black communities don't need fewer cops, they need more cops to stop the crime. That's exactly what Black Lives Matter will never allow, and more black people will die because of it. How about pulling people over for speeding, driving while black? The DOJ and the New Jersey Attorney General commissioned a study in the 1990s after the DOJ accused the New Jersey Highway Patrol of being biased against black folks. And what they found is that black people sped disproportionately. Blacks were 25% of all speeders. They were pulled over 23% of the time. How about sentencing disparities? You hear this one a lot too, and the one that people normally cite is the disparity between crack cocaine sentencing and powder cocaine sentencing. The idea being white people do powder and black people do crack, and therefore black people who go to prison for longer sentences because of crack, that's racism in the criminal justice system. This neglects a few things. 1, crack is more addictive than powder cocaine. 2, it's easier to distribute than powder cocaine. 3, the lead sponsor of all of the legislation with regard to crack cocaine and increased sentencing in the 1980s were black legislators from the inner cities who are sick of watching their cities become prey to the crack epidemic. If you want to compare white and black drug crime laws, then why not use solid substances like crystal meth? 80% of the people arrested for crystal meth charges are white. The sentences for crystal meth per ounce are exactly the same, identical to those for crack cocaine. By the way, the idea that the jails are filled with black and Hispanic people because of the war on drugs, it's not true. Just 16% of state prisoners were convicted for drug offenses. Most of the drug offenses involve distribution. Only 3.6% of state prisoners are in for simple drug possession, and that's typically not a guy in his dorm room smoking a bong. That's typically some guy who's out distributing and then pled down to a simple drug possession charge and ended up in jail. But all of this is white privilege. You can't explain any of these disparities with simple logic like I just did or with facts like I just did. It's all white privilege. It's just out there. It's the evil white guy. You can't point to the evil white guy, but it's the evil white guy. When Baltimore, when it riots, and it's largely black, and has a majority minority police force, and a black police chief, and a black mayor, and a black city council, and a black president, and a black attorney general, when it burns itself up because a black guy gets killed by several police officers, several of whom are black, that's white privilege. And if we're going to be fair about privilege, if we're going to talk about the people who are really privileged in the United States, perhaps we ought to start with the Asians, the nefarious Asians, right? Because the fact is that the evil, terrible Asians have been schlonging us all, as Donald Trump might put it. Asians do better on standardized tests. They have to do better on standardized tests in order to get into college. A Princeton University study from a few years ago showed that blacks receive a bonus of 230 points on the SATs. This is back in the days when it was out of 1,600. Versus their competitors, Asians received a penalty of 50 points. And they deserve it, right? I mean, they really do. I mean, we really know that the founding Asians just created the documents and created the system specifically to just destroy the rest of us, which is why the Constitution is written in Korean. Now, as you might notice in all of this, accusing a racial group of privilege without evidence sounds an awful lot like horrible racism. But that's what the left constantly does. Fact-based perspectives, good decisions, these are not a privilege, these are decisions. And the impact of those decisions is predictable. When someone asks you to check your privilege, you should ask them to check their character. More likely than not, it is missing. White privilege is a way to divide, it's a way to silence. We can all agree discrimination is terrible. We can all stand together when a black person is wrongly shot by the police. But to attribute that shooting to unspecified white privilege and then state that America itself is racist, as Colin Kaepernick has done, is racist in and of itself. You can't assume that white people don't care about innocent black people getting shot without evidence. That is disgusting, and that is racist. Okay, let's move on to trigger warnings. And trigger warnings exist because if you can't achieve equality of outcome, and the left is focused very much on equality of outcome, then instead you want to focus on equality of feelings. We have to feel good about ourselves. Yay. Now, spoiler alert, I'm not big on feelings. If you're not a direct member of my family, then I frankly couldn't care less, and I don't think that you have to care about anybody else's feelings per se. I think facts are more important than feelings, of course. Trigger warnings reflect precisely the opposite point of view. A trigger warning says that if everybody has to feel equal, that means we have to warn people about things that are said that might offend them. We have to warn you that we're going to chat about politics. I have to warn you before I make this speech so that you don't spontaneously combust like a character in a Dickens novel. We wouldn't want anybody to be triggered, because if people are triggered, then somehow they'll never recover from this strain and this shock and this stress. I mean, it's just like the members of the military who have to serve in Iraq and Afghanistan. I know that every time I meet a member of the military, the first thing that I do is I have to give them a bunch of trigger warnings because of all the suffering that's going to happen if I say things that are basically factual. It seems to me that if members of the military can deal with actually being shot at without trigger warnings, you should be able to deal with basic political speak without somebody warning you beforehand. The important point about trigger warnings, the basic notion of trigger warnings, is that nothing subjectively offensive must occur. Nothing subjective. It's not that it's objectively offensive, it's subjectively offensive. If you find it offensive, we have to give you a trigger warning beforehand. We have to tiptoe around you. We have to bend reality to fit you. Your perception of yourself is more important than objective reality. So, for example, if you're like me and you believe in basic human biology and you believe that a man is a man and a woman is a woman, but a man thinks he's a woman, the left says that you cannot, under any circumstances, certainly not without a trigger warning, say that a man is a man if he thinks he's a woman, right? Because otherwise you'll have triggered them and then something terrible will happen. And whenever the left says something terrible will happen, it's sort of like when you warn a small child that they're going to get in trouble, and the child is afraid of trouble, and they have no idea what trouble is. I don't know what the terrible thing that happens is if people are triggered. Does the world end? Do we all die? Does an asteroid hit us? Or are they just a little offended, and then they wake up the next morning and they go do something useful with their life? So you issue the trigger, and the trigger warnings basically have to be issued for the third term of the fourth term of stupid art, which is microaggressions. So I know everybody's very into these microaggressions these days. Everybody's very concerned about microaggressions. These, of course, are little terms, little things that we say that may offend you, even if we don't mean to offend you. So intent is not necessary in order for a microaggression to have occurred. We have a strict liability standard. If someone is offended, you have microaggressed them. I hate the term microaggressions, not only because it's a foolish idea, but also because the term itself has embedded within it the idea that if I say something that offends you, it's not just something that offends you, it is an aggression. An aggression is to be met by aggression. Right? If I microaggress you, you get to punch me because I've microaggressed you now. You get to be aggressive in return. It's elevating verbiage to the level of violence, which, by the way, is what we would call colloquially the end of civilization. Civilization is about the idea that we get to say things without being met with violence. But microaggressions reject that notion. Microaggressions are an excuse for the fascist boot to come down and squash you. The word, as I say, and microaggressions, I mean, you all know this because you go to Yale, but if you're watching this online, you don't know what a microaggression is. If you use terms like he and she instead of words that don't exist that we're currently making up in a back room somewhere here, This is a microaggression. People have to be able to pick their own pronouns. Which, I mean, honestly, it sounds like a lot of fun to me. I've been watching a lot of Game of Thrones, so I prefer that all of you address me as Your Grace from here on in. If you say he and she, that's a microaggression. If you say things like, where are you from? That's a microaggression, which kills half of the pickup lines ever uttered. Right? If you say I'm colorblind, that's a microaggression because no one is colorblind. So if you say you hate racism, that's a microaggression because we're all racist. But if you say you're a racist, that's a macroaggression because you're not allowed to be racist. So good luck. The only commonality among all of these is that people find them offensive subjectively, not objectively. And then because you're mad, you get to reach out and hit somebody. And the way that you can tell this, when I spoke at Cal State LA, there was a professor who didn't like that I was there, and so he wrote on his door, he put up a whiteboard, and he wrote on there, the only real answer to microaggressions is macroaggressions. And unfortunately, this has bled up into the kind of leftist ether all throughout the United States. And we see it all the time. My favorite story about this is, of course, the CNN headline news story. How many of you have ever watched CNN headline news? This is a well-educated crowd, I would assume some. Show of hands, how many people have watched CNN headline news? Okay, that's the entire viewership of CNN headline news. Okay, so I was asked to go on CNN headline news. This would have been sometime last year. This is right around the time when Caitlyn Jenner was about to get the Hero of the Century Award from ESPN for the great heroic act of invading Normandy. No, I'm sorry. I mean for the great heroic act of having a couple of gender surgeries and some hormone treatment and being mentally ill. So they asked me to come on CNN headline news to discuss this because I'm the only conservative in a 30-mile radius of the CNN studios in LA. It's actually in the white pages. It just says conservative, and there's my name. I'm the only one. So they asked me, would you come on? And I said, sure. They get me in the green room and they say, I think that you should know we have no ratings. And I said, don't worry, I'm well aware. And they said, and the producer says, so we brought you on and we want you to speak your mind. And I said, well, that's good because I don't really do anything else. And, excuse me. And the producer says, also, by the way, I'm a producer. I used to be a producer for Jerry Springer. It was at that point I should have had second thoughts about this whole enterprise. But I instead said, okay, and we get out there, they put me on set, and it's me, and there's 3 people next to me, and then there's 3 people on the panel, if I recall correctly. There's 6 people total. So it's me against 6 leftists, which makes it almost fair for them. And they start the debate, and the debate is Caitlyn Jenner just a regular hero or a superhero, right? Can Caitlyn Jenner actually fly? Does Caitlyn Jenner, should Caitlyn Jenner be given a Medal of Honor, or actually should we reserve an honorary spot in Arlington National Cemetery for his heroism? So the debate starts, and we're having this wonderful comparative discussion about whether Caitlyn Jenner is greater than Moses or even greater than Jesus Christ, and finally they come to me, and I say, I don't understand what Caitlyn Jenner is doing that's heroic. And I neglected to mention one part of the story. The person they'd sat next to me, because Jerry Springer producer, the person they'd sat next to me was a transgender woman named Zoe Tur, who used to be Bob Tur, who outweighed me by about 30 pounds and had a voice at least an octave lower than mine. So we're having this discussion, and I say, I don't understand what's so heroic about what Caitlyn Jenner has done. And he says, you don't know anything about genetics, little boy. And I said, well, I know enough to know that every cell in Caitlyn Jenner's body has a Y chromosome in it, with, ironically, the exception of some of his sperm cells. And he says, well, you really don't know anything about genetics. He just keeps repeating this, little boy, you don't know anything about genetics. And finally I said, well, what are your genetics, sir? And it was the sir that set him off. And so this is live on national television. He reaches over and he grabs me by the back of the neck on national TV. You can go online, you can see the tape. It's interesting. It was more interesting when you were part of it, let me tell you. He reaches over and grabs me by the back of the neck, and he says, if you don't cut that out, you're going home in an ambulance. And I thought to myself, first of all, you don't go home in an ambulance. But what I said was, that seems mildly inappropriate for a political conversation. And the point of the story is not that I'm a jackass, okay? I might be, but that's not the point of the story. The point of the story is that the other people on the panel, all of them, universally, didn't say to Zoe Tur, take your hands off that person. You don't get to commit acts of physical violence if you disagree or are offended by something. The universal response of the entire panel was, how dare you say that to Zoe? You knew that you were going to offend Zoe. Which is, of course, when I said facts, that's when I said facts don't care about your feelings. That's when I said, okay, well, it doesn't matter. I'm not interested in changing the facts of the situation to fit Zoe Tur's feelings. But everybody thought that the violence was justified. They thought it was all okay. It was fine. By the way, the violent threats continued. After that segment, Zoe Tur is walking off and growls at me, I'll see you in the parking lot. And then goes on Twitter a little bit later and threatens to curb stomp me, all of which I have to say I thought was very unladylike behavior. But the idea here is that I had microaggressed, and therefore I was to be met with macroaggressions. It was so terrible. Whatever I'd said, the word, like, I was brought up to believe that you say sir to men and you say ma'am to women, and he was a biological man, so I was going to call him sir. But that was a microaggression, and therefore I deserved to be met with violence. And this is the dangerous part about the microaggression philosophy. At University of Missouri, when they had the big hubbub last year, the police department actually asked students to report hurtful words. They said, if somebody says something hurtful, call up the PD. This is called fascism, gang. That's totalitarianism. And this reaches ridiculous proportions. I mean, at Brandeis University, they had a situation a couple of years ago where the Brandeis Asian American Students Association, they put out an installation in the public square to bring attention to microaggressions. It was a wall with all sorts of microaggression phrases, and somebody reported them. They had to take it down because it was a microaggression. So once you rid the world of all the trigger warnings and the microaggressions, of course, then you finally have your magical safe space. And again, the implication is clear. If you are subjected to language that offends you, you are now unsafe. In which case, I spend my entire life in an unsafe area, even though, aside from Zoe Tur, I haven't been physically accosted in a long time. You require the protection with men with guns if people disagree with you. You require segregated areas. At University of Missouri, the black students actually dictated that none of the leftist white students be allowed to protest next to them because it violated their segregated safe space, to which the KKK said, awesome, separate and also equal, fantastic. Safe spaces are safe in the way that the Matrix is safe. It's wonderful and it's happy until you realize it's all fake, and society doesn't actually operate by these idiotic rules, and that these ridiculous, stupid rules actually make you into a person who does nasty things. Take, for example, someone that I'm sure some of you know, a girl named Geraldine Luther. The girl who was caught on video shrieking like an insane nut job at Nicholas Christakis. As you all know, and I'm lecturing to the people on tape now, you all go to the schools, so you know, of course, the controversy began because Christakis and his wife Erica, who serve as heads of the residential college Silliman, weren't willing to go along with the PC regime. Before Halloween, the Intercultural Affairs Council, which sounds like a useless bunch if I've ever heard of one, sent an email to students telling them not to wear costumes that would threaten our sense of community. Because as we all know, the Holocaust started because of costuming mistakes. This being rather vague, Erica, a professor of developmental psychology, sent out an email asking, have we lost faith in young people's capacity, in your capacity to exercise self-censure through social norming, and also in your capacity to ignore or reject things that trouble you? Well, it turns out you should have lost faith in young people's ability to do any of those things and not be stupid, precious snowflake losers. Over 700 students and faculty and alum signed an open letter whining, in your email you ask students to look away if costumes are offensive, as if the degradation of our cultures and people and the violence that grows out of it is something that we can't ignore. Forgive me, was there a giant Halloween costume pogrom sometime in the recent past at this university? Did I miss it? Did I miss the part where people dressed up in Halloween costumes and then went around killing black folks? Like really, when was this time that the violence that grew out of Halloween costumes was super threatening to minorities on this campus? Seriously, maybe I missed it. So Nicholas went outside and he encountered 100 students in the residential college quad, and the intrepid social justice warrior Luther confronted him, and there she screams at him and told him it was his job to create a place of comfort for students as though she was a small child needing a nap. When he said that that was not, in fact, his job, she decided that screaming at him would be the proper solution, like my 2.5-year-old daughter would do, demanded he apologize, told him to be quiet, called him disgusting, and wailed, who the fuck hired you? It turned out, by the way, she was actually on the search team that brought him to Yale. Nonetheless, the gauntlet had been thrown. 1,000 of you Yale students then joined a march of resistance. You guys are so brave, all you people resisting the, 3 rounds of applause for you folks, so brave, marching against the sexy nurses on Halloween. The students demanded that all the undergraduates take useless ethnic study courses, which are only good for meeting chicks, as I know when I took Jewish studies courses. They also qualify you, by the way, to be a useless ethnic studies professor at some point. They also recommended that there be mental health professionals to join all the cultural centers, which actually might be not such a bad idea. They wanted the title master to be abolished, and they wanted the Christakises to be fired. And the Yale administration, because they're sad and pathetic, they caved. So Dean Holloway, he said that he supported the IAC Halloween costume guidelines. He called them exactly right. They increased the budget for the cultural centers, and they abolished the title master. Of course, the word master comes from the Latin word magister, which means chief, head, director, or teacher, and in academic settings has always meant expertise in a subject, which is why some of you, I'm sure, here are earning master's degrees. I don't think anyone here holds slaves. A show of hands, slaveholders, because you're earning a master's degree. Does a free slave come along with it? I didn't think so. All of this nonsense makes people totally crazy. It just makes them insane. It makes you stupid and emotionally stunted, like Geraldine Luther and the people who agree. You're all being made crazy. Jonathan Haidt is a sociologist, professor of psychology at NYU, and he says the recent collegiate trend of uncovering allegedly racist, sexist, classist, or otherwise discriminatory microaggressions does not incidentally teach students to focus on small or accidental slights. Its purpose is to get students to focus on them and then relabel the people who have made such remarks as aggressors. This is actually the opposite for the psych majors in the room. This is the opposite of one of the only forms of psychology that's ever been known to work at all, which is cognitive behavioral therapy, where you have a chain of thoughts that lead you to be depressed, and your psychologist says, maybe you should break those chains of thoughts and maybe determine whether the person actually meant to offend you. Maybe you should think whether this is something worth getting upset about. This vicious cycle creates adults unwilling to face up to reality, determined to blame the world for their problems, convinced that the more they claim offense, the more they deserve from others. It's not just un-American, it's unhealthy, and it makes people evil. Professor Roy Baumeister writes a great book called Evil, Inside Human Violence and Cruelty, and he says that evil springs from idealism that turns to violence, unjustified self-esteem, and hypersensitivity. Does any of this sound familiar? Self-appointed victimhood is really, really dangerous stuff, and that's what all of these terms in the end are all about. And millions of students are learning it each year, which is why a November 2015 Pew poll showed that 40% of millennials, people aged 18 to 34, I'm 32, so we're all in the same group here, believe the government should be able to prevent people from making, quote, statements that are offensive to minority groups. The government should do that. Okay, this would involve repeal of the First Amendment. But that is the logic of a philosophy that prizes protection of feelings above protection of individual rights. America is the greatest experiment in the history of planet Earth with the best value system. And it's a value system that, unfortunately, the left and the campus left have been trying to destroy now for 3 generations. Nobody is better off in a system of fake diversity, or preaching phantom white privilege, or whining about trigger warnings, or being offended by microaggressions, or retreating to fake safe spaces that don't really exist in the real world. We are all better off when we embrace fundamentally good values, when we share values of responsibility and decency together. So what are some of those common fundamental values we should be teaching? Let's start with the ones embodied in the Constitution: freedom of speech, of religion, of the press, of assembly and petition, and let's add in some basic civic values. Don't have babies without being married. Don't engage in crime. Don't do violence to people who disagree with you. If we're all better to one another, not in terms of being oversensitive or worrying we're all going to offend one another, but in assuming that we probably will at some point offend one another from time to time, and that's okay. We can live together. You don't have to care what I think. I don't have to care what you think. That's the wonderful thing about America. That doesn't mean we should go around insulting everybody, but it does mean we have to respect facts as facts and opinions as opinions and insults as insults, and they're not all the same thing. And then we don't have to shut down debate. We don't have to strong-arm protesters and destroy the country in order to make ourselves feel good. We can actually feel good about what we share together. A constitutional system that prizes individual liberty and individual responsibility, a simple goodness that agrees to disagree about what we do in our own lives, but agrees generally that being a mensch, being a decent human being, is required of everybody. We share not our own truths, this phrase, my truth, there's no such thing as your truth, there's just the truth and then there's your opinion. We don't share our own truths, but actual factual truths and actual standards. We're all in this together, and we're all going to have to share a country. So let's stop letting the fascist left separate us with buzzwords and tyranny of subjective feelings. If we do that, then finally we'll be able to build what the founders foresaw and what Martin Luther King dreamed of and what generations fought and bled and died to achieve: a society of values rather than races, of commonality rather than polarization, and of truth rather than lies. Thanks so much. Happy to take your questions. Thank you. Thanks so much. All righty. Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
All right, we're gonna
let's take some questions, and my only rule, you guys will handle the questioning, but my rule is if you're left, you get to go first, because it's more interesting and more fun. Do you dare? That's it.
Hi.
Hey, how's it going?
Is this on? Okay. Why are you doing this? Is it for fame?
I don't understand. This being...
I'm asking, why do you give these lectures and say these things? Is it because it's going to make you more famous?
No, if I wanted to be more famous, then I'd write a TV show and take off my pants. I mean, no, the purpose of giving these lectures is to speak basic truths to generally crowds of people who either disagree with those basic truths. I encourage more leftists to come to my lectures, and also to arm people who believe in truth with facts that they can use to combat lies. That's the purpose of the lectures. Also, I get paid.
What's going on, Ben? Love your program, love all that stuff.
Oh, thank you, I appreciate it.
Absolutely. I think as kind of a millennial conservative, constitutional conservative, one of the biggest threats and one of the hardest things to respond to from people on the left is when they talk about the utopia of the Nordic countries, because they are oftentimes armed with a lot of facts in regards to the efficiency of their public programs and things to that effect. So how would you recommend responding to those claims of the utopianism of the Nordic countries?
Okay, so the first thing that's important to notice about the Nordic countries is that the Nordic countries are, by and large, extraordinarily ethnically homogenous. So they're not comparable and culturally homogenous as well. So Vermont looks a lot like Norway. Right? Bernie Sanders' philosophy works in Vermont and it works in Norway, but it only works for a temporary period of time because Vermont doesn't have its own defense budget, and really neither does Norway. Right? We've been paying for the Nordic countries' defense budgets for a long time. Also, it's worthwhile noting that the taxes in these countries are extraordinarily high, and the countries are going bankrupt anyway. So for about a 15-year period, 20-year period, the Nordic countries have been experiencing extraordinarily slow growth, which has led them to actually elect more right-wing governments on economics and deregulate their economies, because it turns out people don't like paying twice the amount that it costs for a normal car. Right? The income tax rate in places like Denmark for middle-class people, not for upper-class people, for middle-class people is like 60%. So, it's easy for students to say 60% sounds good, but you all go to Yale, which means that eventually you'll have a job that pays you enough that you'll be paying a high percentage of your income in taxes, and it ain't that much fun. There's a reason that Denmark, all these countries are now turning away from this, and they've been living off the back of America paying for their defense budget for a very long time. So you have the privilege of not having to pay your own defense budget. You also have a group of what can best be described as upper education people who have grown up in Western countries with a particular set of values. And socialism, at least in the Nordic way, not full government ownership of resources, but high redistribution of income, that is capable of lasting for a certain period of time, but even there it collapses.
Hi, Ben.
Howdy.
So unconscious bias is a concept well documented in psychological studies, which is basically that people associate negative things with people of color and positive things with whites. So if that is true, given that that is true, how does white privilege not exist?
Okay, so you're asking about unconscious bias. I apologize because it's kind of echoey, but the question was, if there is unconscious bias, just to repeat it so I'm making sure I get it right, if there is unconscious bias, how does white privilege not exist?
The question is, given that there is unconscious bias, how does white privilege not exist?
So number one, when I speak about white privilege, so when I speak about white privilege, I'm speaking specifically about behavior. Okay, there have been no studies, and really I've looked at these studies, the connection between what they call implicit bias, this is their favorite phrase now, implicit bias, unconscious bias, and biased behavior has yet to be proven at any level that is even remotely necessary to be used in, for example, a courtroom, which is why it's never been used in a courtroom. It is also true that there is no way, there really isn't, there's been no proven way to alleviate what they call unconscious bias, which means that we're ghost hunting. So what I would suggest is that if there is unconscious bias, and I'll acknowledge the possibility or the reality of unconscious bias, if there is, then I need you to I don't care about what's in people's heads so much as what they do. So if you point me to a racist behavior, don't worry, I'll let you respond. If you point me to a racist behavior, I'm happy to stand alongside you and protest it. What I can't do is protest about things in people's head that I don't know about because I'm not a mind reader.
Okay, so that's a really interesting response, and to that I have two questions. Firstly, what I've heard you say that this is something that, the way people think doesn't affect their behavior. So that's the first thing you've said. So I'm really curious if you can kind of give me another example of a thought that somebody has which doesn't affect their behavior. Like, do people who, support Trump not vote for him? Like, I'm very curious about that.
Yes.
And secondly, so the second thing that I want to ask is that if it's something it's hard to fix, does it mean we shouldn't do anything about it? Because you said, I don't know if we can change how people think. Does that mean we shouldn't try?
I mean, first of all, not a great impression. But beyond that, my voice isn't that low. But beyond that, as far as the first question, which is, do people have thoughts that don't manifest in behavior? Yes, all the time.
For instance,
every thought that you have about walking up here and strangling me right now. I assume we have thoughts all the time that don't manifest in behavior, and this is true every single day. We consider thoughts that cross our minds. The problem with unconscious bias is the idea is you don't even know that you're having the thought, right? So how can you stop it if you don't even know that you're having it? But then we should be able to gauge the unconscious bias and its impact on behavior. That's why it's unconscious bias as opposed to conscious bias. The idea behind unconscious bias is that it's not even a ghost, it's a ghost of a ghost, because you don't even know you're having the thought. So people, the whole idea behind diversity training is the idea that you can retrain people to stop their chain of thought in order so that it doesn't manifest in behavior. I don't think that every thought manifests in behavior. If it did, then every time a man saw a good-looking woman walk down the street, a straight man saw a good-looking woman down the street, we'd have a real mess on our hands. So the second question, the idea was a little too broad for me to respond to, which is just because something is tough, don't we have to face up to it? Yes, we have to face up to tough things all the time. And one of the tough things I would suggest that we face up to is that you have a lot more control over your own behavior and the decisions you make than the supposedly widespread unconscious bias of people you've never met.
Hi. So you spoke a bit about the the boost and the negation of the SAT scores that black applicants may receive with comparison to Asian people or in comparison to white people.
Yeah, I spoke about the Princeton study, correct.
And you also spoke about how there is not an equality of outcome in this nation. So with regard to this...
No, there is inequality of outcome.
Yeah.
There's no inequality of opportunity, yes.
Yes.
In the sense that there's no government obstacles. They're inequality, just to clarify before you finish the question, I promise, I'll let you finish. When I say there's no inequalities of opportunity, I obviously don't mean that we are all equally situated. I will never be an NBA basketball player. It's never going to happen. Although I could probably make the Lakers roster. They're that bad. But go ahead.
Given that you contend that there is an equality of opportunity in this nation, do you think it is right for the government to pursue, or like for federal cases to say that in some cases policies like affirmative action targeting certain ethnic groups are correct, and doing this, does it acknowledge white privilege, or do we just leave this sort of policies totally out even though there is inequality of outcome?
No. So my answer about affirmative action and government policies that are meant to rectify these inequalities of outcome, no, I'm very much opposed to those. If you have two people who have equal SAT scores, and one of them happens to have had a bad childhood with obstacles to overcome, and one happens to have grown up in a very rich household, then that's an actual factor that has to be taken into account. But if somebody gets an SAT score that's 200 points below somebody else, and the only differentiating factor is their race, that's racism. I mean, I remember a few years back there was a story in the Wall Street Journal about an Asian kid who got like a 1510 on his SATs when it was out of 1600, and he grew up extremely poor, single mother, it was a rough neighborhood, so he had to study in his closet for fear of gunshots and all this stuff, and he applied to Yale, didn't get in, and he didn't get in because he was Asian. If he'd been black, he would have gotten in. I mean, that sort of stuff is just racism pure and simple. I don't understand why Colin Powell's kid is not worse off than that Asian kid was. And we're all differently situated, so let's look at each other as individuals. There's some black people who have it really bad in this country. There's some black people who have it really great in this country. There are a lot of white people who have it really bad in this country. There are more white people on food stamps than black people, by a large margin. There are more white people on welfare than black people by a large margin, which is not to suggest that black people are not on average poorer than white people, because they are. But we're going to be in a much better position to do justice when we stop focusing so much on the perversion that's known as social justice. Social justice stands in direct contravention and opposition to justice. Justice is about you take action, you get what you deserve. Social justice is about you take action, and we may or may not give you what you deserve based on what we think your social group deserves. And that's evil. That really is. I mean, the idea that we're going to not judge the individual, we're instead going to judge what is most apropos for society based on the group to which you belong, and in some cases to which we arbitrarily place you, that's actually evil. Social justice is another word for redistribution of outcome and unfairness. Justice is a word that doesn't need a modifier. Like the word good doesn't need a modifier. Social justice doesn't need a modifier. You add social to it, you're detracting from the original word.
Good evening, Mr. Shapiro. Thank you for coming down. On basically the same topic, then how do you address the differences in, like, for instance, the educational system between inner city schools, which usually have worse infrastructure, many times have lack qualified teachers or lack teachers, period, versus schools in affluent neighborhoods? How do you try to get justice to the students living in inner cities versus those living in affluent neighborhoods?
Right. So I mean, the answer to me is more individual freedom, not less. One of the great problems is that people think government action is what rectifies these situations. It doesn't matter how much money you dump into inner city public schools if, number one, you don't have any sort of community or family structure that supports education, and this isn't just true of black communities, it's true, there's J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy is a really worthwhile book, you should read it. It's all about a kind of downtrodden white communities in Ohio, and they have some similar problems to a lot of inner city black communities. The solution here is twofold. One, give parents more choice in where they send their kids to school, and two, a reversion to an actual belief in parental responsibility. Because the truth is that the idea that kids are failing in the inner city because they just have bad teachers isn't true. I mean, if you've ever met the teachers in the inner city, some of them are wonderful. And some of them, they're really doing the best they can, I think. I think the bigger problem that you have is when you have broken families and you have people who are not inculcating the value of education, and when you have people who are saying to young people, and this is true all over the country regardless of race, this is one of my problems with this election, is I think all of the candidates in their own way are basically saying, you're a victim of the society, so individual responsibility no longer devolves to you. If you actually have parents saying to their own kids, okay, I expect you to do well. I expect you to get an education. It's not a suggestion, it's an expectation that you're going to work hard. Then there really is, that's the only way that this is ever going to get solved. Parents are I have my own kids, I'm the one, in the end, even if there are no, I'm not going to send my kid to public school. I'm going to send my kid to private schools because the public schools in my area are a failure. LAUSD spends about $10,000 per student per year, and it's the worst school district in America. I'm going to send my kids to private school, but even if there were no private schools available, my job is educating my kids, just like my job is feeding my kids. My job is to take care of my kids. If I do nothing else in my life, taking care of my kids is my sole responsibility, and people who fail to recognize this You want to talk about what's the number one problem in America? That's the number one problem in America, is people running away from their responsibility to their kids and to their family members and to their parents. If we all took care of our kids and our family members and our parents, there wouldn't be any need for the government to come in and screw everything up royally like it does.
Hi, Ben. I'm not a Yale student, but I'm down here because I was interested in the presentation. The question I have is related to affirmative action, and it's a topic that I don't think is discussed often. And the topic is such that, you know, me seeing affirmative action at universities and in the workplace, I work for the state of Connecticut, where we have an affirmative action department, and some of the hiring is based upon race. And the thing I don't hear discussed is basically the downside of this being that, you know, for myself, anytime I'm looking at people maybe applying for jobs or getting things, or me selecting a physician or a lawyer or something, this question is coming to my mind, and I don't think it's fair for me to have this in my mind, but it's like, well, are they where they are because of some policy like affirmative action? Is that how they got to be where they were, or are they really qualified, whether it's a pilot, a lawyer, anything like that? And this is the thing I think a lot of people have in their minds, is they're not sure nowadays if people are getting where they are because they got some, you know, privilege because of their race, or they really worked for it. And you know, that's something in the back of my mind and other people I talk to, and I wanted your opinion on that.
Well, I mean, I think obviously that's true. I mean, if there are programs that benefit a particular group of people at the expense of another group of people, people are going to wonder whether the beneficiary group got there through merit or whether they got through because of a specific program. I mean, that's just normal human response. You know, does that mean that the person actually got there not because of merit? Of course not, and that's not what you're saying. But that question is an open question. I mean, obviously, if you know that some people in a particular group got 5 points extra on a test, you don't know which of those people got 5 points extra on the test. I'll also say that affirmative action, which I'm against all the way across the board, it becomes particularly counterproductive in the realm of public sector contracts. When you're talking about the government hiring people with lower standards because of their race, I don't care what the race is of the fireman who saves me. I just care that he's able to carry my fat rear out the back door. And you know, I think that the government shouldn't be in the business of trying to rectify all of history's injustices. The government should be in the business of trying to find the best people for the job, since I'm a taxpayer and I pay those people's salary.
Thank you. One thing that you didn't talk that much about was multiculturalism. So I saw a wonderful video that you did on radical Islam, and I'm curious how we address when different cultures might actually have radically different values. How do we start to have that conversation? Well,
I mean, the first thing you have to do is be honest about that. I mean, this idea, and it's promulgated by right, left, and center, that everybody down deep has the same values. I mean, it's in the Declaration of Independence, the idea that these truths are self-evident. And sorry to break it to everybody, the truths are not self-evident. If they were self-evident, then everybody would have them. Right? If they were self-evident, every country would have a Declaration of Independence. They're an outgrowth of a specific Judeo-Christian culture that grew into an Enlightenment, which grew into the Declaration of Independence. The idea that everyone around the world wants the same thing is actually significantly disrespectful to people from different cultures who have different priorities and believe different things. When I say disrespectful, I don't mean that their cultures are great. I think a lot of cultures out there are absolute horse crap. But it is true, of course, that people have different priorities and different cultures and different belief systems. I mean, I was speaking with one of my security guys, and he was a former military guy, served in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he was saying that one of his buddies had a situation where he was raiding an Afghani weapons cache, and he walked in. There's a 7-year-old with an AK. Okay, that's a result of a culture that does not value children in the same way that Western culture values children. And Western culture didn't always value children the way the Western culture now values children, which is why people used to have 10 kids and 5 of them would die, and then you'd have more kids, right? They didn't even used to name kids for the first couple of months in many Western cultures. So culture shifts over time, and it's important to recognize these differences in culture because you have to know what the obstacles are and the differences are before you can actually come to an agreement about what can change and what can't be changed. It's a little bit of a world-beating notion that you can walk into Iraq and magically change it into a Western democracy, as George W. Bush found out. And it's also a bit of foolishness on the part of the left that any person from any culture is necessarily going to hold the same values that we are. When people say, everybody loves their children, well, it's hard for me to say everybody loves their children when I see pictures of Hamas terrorists strapping a suicide bomb on a 3-year-old. I don't think that person loves his child. I think I like his child more than he does, probably.
We just have time for a couple more, so.
How's it going, Ben? I have a question, kind of a legal question that's in the news lately. Colin Kaepernick doesn't want to stand for the national anthem.
Uh-huh.
And I'd like to bring ESPN fired Kurt Schilling for having different opinions that they wanted to promote.
Yes.
Can the NFL, Roger Goodell, technically just get rid of Colin Kaepernick from their...
I don't know how the contractual situation works between the NFL and the teams, whether he can, I suppose he could suspend him or fire him for conduct detrimental to the league. It's a private organization. It can do it at once. ESPN can fire Kurt Schilling. You may disagree with their decision to fire Kurt Schilling. I did, but I think that the idea that the NFL is somehow barred from doing that is silly. Now, do I think the NFL should get rid of Colin Kaepernick? No, I don't, actually. I think that Colin Kaepernick should be allowed to do that, and people should be allowed to boo him and root against him and hope that he gets sacked every time he gets on the field. I think that's probably the best solution.
Hi. I just have a couple of questions of clarification. So,
sure.
You touched on it a little bit towards the end of your lecture, but if you could describe more, elaborate more on what you mean by decency and these fundamental values, especially in light of the statements that you just made in response to the question, not this last question, but before this, recognizing the fluidity of culture and cultural values and the existence of cultures that don't necessarily share the same values, and how do you account for that, moving towards a common set of values? How do you, if you believe that it is useful, develop coalition politics in order to move towards a collective sense of value? How do you reconcile individual motivation if you believe fundamentally?
There's a lot of complexity here, but yes.
Yeah, but honestly, these are high-stakes questions.
Not to go all religious on you, but leaving aside the religious aspects of the 10 Commandments, I think that would be a pretty good place to start with basic decency. Right? Don't steal, I'm a deeply religious person. I'm an Orthodox Jew. I don't think that it's mandated that everybody believe in God, obviously, and I think that, and I understand the arguments for atheism. That said, I think that, basic values that we in Western civilization tend to share, things like you don't get to kill people, you don't get to kidnap people. I think that values that have developed later, anti-slavery values, for example, that are a later breaking development from Western civilization, but have roots in Judeo-Christian civilization. Those are values that are fundamental values of decency. The ones embodied in the Constitution seem to me to be good values. Like, I don't get to harm you because I don't get to use the government as a club against you because I disagree with what you say. I don't get to use the government as a club against you because I disagree with your religious practice that doesn't infringe on me. I have sort of a John Stuart Mill view of interpersonal decency when it comes to governmental intervention, and that is I get to wave my fist around as much as I want so long as it doesn't hit your face. Well, give me an example. So as I say, the John Stuart Mill system would definitely not value slavery. I mean, that's not me waving my fist around until I hit your face. That's me putting you in chains. I mean, that's a fundamental human evil because I'm violating somebody else's rights. So it's the basic value that originally springs from the notion that we're all created in God's image, and then consummates in the idea that we're all equal under God, and that we all have equal rights under God. That doesn't allow things like slavery, and it fights against things like slavery. Now, where I think that some people get dicey about this, I don't want to lead you here, but I think this is where some people get dicey about this idea, is they say, okay, well, what about the things where I'm waving my fist around and I'm not formally hitting you in the face, but you're getting me upset? So, for example, if you have a private business and the private business decides to discriminate against Jews, right, or decides to discriminate against blacks or against gays, right, what would you do about that? So I don't think the government has any business telling private businesses what to do, because I think that capitalism is colorblind, and that means that if somebody discriminates against Jews or blacks or gays, they'll go out of business. There will be other people who offer their services. The problem is, once you start to let government or society take a forced stand, an enforced stand as to what quote unquote good behavior is and bad behavior is, you start to get into real trouble. But I think we can all agree what actual harming behavior looks like. Actual harming behavior is not me denying you a service that I don't owe you in the first place. Actual harming behavior is me stealing something from you, punching you, taking your children. You know, something that you have a right to, I'm taking away from you. And you don't have a right to my services. No one does.
So just to be clear, is that something that you would define, this is my last question. Is that something that you would define in objection, I mean, that you set sort of in opposition to things like microaggressions and whatever the ones that you find to be false on the grounds that they are subjectively offensive, are the things that you just listed things that you would find to be objectively offensive?
Well, I mean, so now you're getting into a broader question, which is, are any values objective or subjective? All values, I suppose, in the end, are going to be subjective, but I think the ones that we can most easily agree on, and the one to which there's an objective standard anyway, that doesn't require you to read my mind, let's find a standard where we don't have to read each other's mind. So a standard where I don't have, microaggressions require me to read your mind. I have to try and figure out what's going to offend you and what's not. I don't have to read your mind to know you probably don't want me to punch you in the face. Right? Like there's an objective standard there where I don't have to read your mind. We all sort of agree. And if we can't agree on that, we can't agree on literally anything, and then society's over. So I guess time to buy your food parcels and build your bomb shelters, if that's the case. If we can't all agree it's bad to hit each other in the face, then we have no place to start. Thanks so much.
All right, this will be the last question, right?
Hi. So throughout your speech, you kind of treat the left as sort of this monolithic group of people.
Yeah, like a terrible block of terrible people.
Exactly.
Sure.
Yeah, it's exactly what I'm talking about. Like at one point, for example, he said the left hate free speech. The left only care about diversity but not values.
Right, it's shorthand.
The left is trying to destroy America's value system. My first question to you is, isn't this sort of kind of generalized hyperbolic language divisive, and doesn't it kind of add to division instead of bringing America together? And my second question is, do you acknowledge that the left is composed of a wide, diverse range of people with diverse viewpoints?
Of course. Oh, here's what I define the left as. So, good question. Here's what I define the left as if the speech didn't make it clear. Excuse me. When I say that the fundamental left value, if you believe this, you are on the left. If you believe that fairness of outcome is more important than than equality of rights, then you are on the left. Is it possible to be on the left but not believe that? I mean, it depends on an issue-by-issue case. You may agree with the left, but I don't think that you are on the left. I mean, since I'm the one speaking, I get to make the definition. But that being the case, by my definition, that's what I mean. When you're asking me what I mean when I say the left. Now you're asking me to read your mind and tell you what you mean when you say the left. What I mean when I say the left is the left means people who believe equality of outcome trumps equality of opportunity. Now, if you want to say that there are people who don't believe that who are on the left, you're using another definition, not the one that I'm using, which is okay. I mean, we can talk about your definition.
But by that logic, would you acknowledge that there are people who are liberals but who aren't under your definition?
That I will acknowledge, which is why I specifically don't use the term liberals. I don't equate liberals and leftists. They're not the same. I think there are liberals who believe what old school liberals used to believe. The whole idea, I may disagree with you, but I'll die for your right to say it. But that's a liberal value. That's not a leftist value.
But I mean, this kind of idea of your left. How big of a population do you think this is? Do you think that embodies a majority of liberals? I don't understand. Like, I think that.
Well, I think
when I hear you say left, I
think it embodies a majority of the people who ardently believe in the Democratic Party platform. To be more specific,
so you think that most people who are Democrats are under your definition of left?
No, I think most people who deeply study and believe in the Democratic Party platform are leftists. I think most people who vote Democrat do so because they think Republicans are assholes. I mean.
Thank you all so much for coming. Have a good night. Thanks.